Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Dave from Schoharie Crossing, and you're the audience. This is the 8th annual New York State History Month lecture series offered by Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. And this evening, we are excited to have Pathways of Resistance being provided to you. Derrick Pratt is the Director of Education and Public Programming at the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, New York. A native of Chittenango, New York, Derrick received a BA in Social Studies education from SUNY Cortland and an MA in Museum Studies from Syracuse University. Prior to his job at the Erie Canal Museum, Derrick served as a director of programs at Chittenango Landing Canal Boat Museum for over 3 years. He has developed amazing programming at the Erie Canal Museum and outside of its walls as well, bringing history of the canal to the streets with walking tours and such programs as beers, bikes, and barges across the entire Canalway. You can find his culinary talents available on the Erie Canal Museum's YouTube channel and the series Cookin on the Canals, as well as many other Erie Canal Museum related videos. He's a member in good standing of the secret international canal cartel. But now that I mention that out loud, you'll just have to ignore what I just said. And please welcome Derrick Pratt.
All right, thank you. Yeah, good to be here. Always enjoy doing stuff with Harry Crossing, even if it's virtual. Thanks for having me, David. Always a pleasure. You know, shouldn't have mentioned our secret society. Also earlier before the recording started, there's that talk on a famous dog. Hopefully my dog does not become famous tonight, but she might bark at some point. So my apologies in advance to everyone. Anyway, we are going to talk today about the Erie Canal, the Abolition Movement, and the Underground Railroad movement in this talk titled Pathways of Resistance. A little quick history on this talk. It sprang out of research we did following the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the spring of 2020 and the ensuing discussion about race that we kind of collectively had as a nation. The Erie Canal Museum committed then to doing more to tell stories of Black and other marginalized communities along the canal. And the first result was, like David mentioned, a walking tour, the Pathways of Resistance walking tour, where we took people around downtown Syracuse, especially these canal side sites, and talked about how they related to the abolition movement. This talk was kind of a next step in that. And we are continuing at the museum with those efforts to this day, and we keep expanding. To make this talk, I should just mention a few sources that we consulted. Among them were the National Abolition Hall of Fame, the Onondaga Historic Association, a number of first-person accounts from the abolition era. We also worked with the National Park Service and specifically the Harriet Tubman National Parks site in Auburn. And also shout out to Craig Williams and the New York State Canal Society, who also was very helpful in doing research for this talk. All right, so to get started, to understand, to understand abolition in New York, first we have to understand, the institution of slavery in New York, what would eventually become New York as well. Pretty well-known date nowadays. 1619 is when the first enslaved African people arrive in the British North American colonies in Jamestown. It's less than a decade later, in 1626, that 11 Congolese and Angolan enslaved people are brought to the city of New Amsterdam in the Dutch colony of New Netherlands, which will eventually become New York City and New York, when the British take over in the late 1600s. And under the British, New York City specifically would become a major slave trading hub for the British Empire in North America. And in fact, New York would grow to become one of the largest slaveholding states in the American colonies. That's the largest slaveholding state north of the Mason-Dixon line. And New York City itself has the second most enslaved people living within it per capita at the time of the Revolution, behind only Charleston, South Carolina. Now, we wanted to, in this talk, kind of break down a number of myths that may currently exist. Like David said, I'm a lifelong upstate New Yorker from Chittenango, and you're like me. I grew up in the New York State education system, and just general society in New York. You kind of get unique, a specific viewpoint is given to you, and kind of myths arise, which we sort of hope to break down. One myth is that kind of the institution of slavery was quote unquote better in these northern states when it existed. And that's not true. Just in general, slavery itself is an abhorrent system. But also, there are a number of examples of laws passed by the colony and state of New York that could be just as brutal and racist as those in southern plantation slavery. But talked a lot about colonial New York. Things begin to change with the institution of slavery in New York with the American Revolution. We have our first kind of law freeing some people in 1781. The state would offer incentives for enslaved people to serve in the Revolution, namely their freedom. Also, enslavers were also offered incentives as well for allowing someone they enslaved to join the army as well. It's estimated that about a quarter of the New York State militia at the Battle of Yorktown was Black, either free or enslaved combined. So a lot of folks take New York up on this offer, serve in the revolutionary forces, and fight for these supposed revolutionary values of liberty, justice, freedom, and equality, right? And fighting for those rights, this nation founded in liberty, all of our core documents are talking about that. It holds up a mirror to American society if we're using that rhetoric. And yet, if you're talking about freedom and liberty, etc., how can you justify enslaving other human beings? And this is another kind of myth we like to push back on, the idea, and you'll hear this a lot even today, that's just how things were back then. No one was really thinking like, man, slavery's bad. That's just not true. And we see that almost immediately after the Revolution. I mean, there were people even before the Revolution fighting against slavery, the Quakers, most notably. But after the Revolution, you have things like the New York Manumission Society founded. And again, you'll hear arguments that, it just wasn't, they were kind of crackpots at the edges of society, maybe, who were fighting for abolition. But the New York Manumission Society is founded in New York City, 1785, fighting for the gradual abolition of slavery. And it contains some of the most prominent figures in New York at the time. You've got John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice, or Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and future New York Governor, Alexander Hamilton. You may have heard of him. Gouverneur Morris, who literally, physically wrote the Constitution, and also was the first Canal Commission's president. So, pretty influential people. It should also be noted, several of those people I listed and several other members of the New York Manumission Society were themselves enslavers. By no means was the New York Manumission Society like an anti-racist society, but you do have powerful people, influential people, as well as plenty of just kind of common, normal, everyday people recognizing slavery is wrong and fighting for its end as soon as there is a New York state. So, the New York Manumission Society and other folks are fighting to eventually abolish slavery, and they start to make progress in 1799. They have the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. This act is sometimes marked as the end of slavery in New York, but that's frankly not true. Not a single person will be freed under this act. Instead, enslaved people are redefined as indentured servants. However, it's not the way we often conceive of indentured servitude, where there's a set period of time where you have an indenture. These indentures are for life. There is practically no difference between slavery. You are afforded a few extra rights. The big difference is made for people born after July 4th, 1799. Children born after that date, women would have to serve a period of indenture, again, essentially slavery, for 25 years, and for men of 28 years. So not a single person is going to be freed by this act legally for a full quarter of a century after this. This is the process of gradual emancipation. If you're good at math, which you're tuning into a history lecture, so who knows if you are, I'm not. But we fight another war during that time period, the War of 1812. Again, just like we saw previously in the Revolution, we've got Black individuals, both free and enslaved, serving the American cause, fighting again for these same kind of principles: liberty, justice, equality, freedom. And again, that mirror gets turned on Americans, and it's kind of like, what are you doing here? How can you fight for these values if you're not actually living them, right? It's hypocrisy, right? There we go. That's the word. So shortly after the war, in 1817, a new act is passed, freeing all enslaved people born before July 4th, 1799. In 10 more years. That law will take effect July 4th, 1827. So July 5th, 1827 is generally marked as the end of slavery in New York. However, people born under that first act will continue to be enslaved. There will be enslaved people in New York into the 1840s. So takes a while. It should also be noted that while Black individuals started to gain some personal freedom, their political freedom was restricted in 1821. The new New York State Constitution passed that year, made it so all white men were allowed to vote with no property restrictions, while Black men were required to own at least $250 worth of property, significant amount at that time. But that's where we're at. New York is abolishing slavery, and all you Erie Canal folks out there might notice that those dates line up pretty well with the digging of the Erie Canal, constructed between 1817 and 1825. Now, we do not have any written evidence that enslaved people helped to dig the Erie Canal. A large part of that could potentially be that canal contracting was not a super precise. There weren't a lot of tracking mechanisms. The state would pay a contractor whose job was then to kind of pay people, or at least ensure that people built the canal. So if there were enslaved people digging any parts of the canal, they wouldn't have shown up in records, most likely. We do have an interesting story from here in Syracuse, that of Isaac Wales. He arrived enslaved in central New York shortly before the canal started to be dug in this area. He purchased his freedom using a loan, and paid that loan off by digging the Erie Canal through what is today's Clinton Square. So that is at least a formerly enslaved person digging the canal. But again, no direct evidence of enslaved people digging the canal. However, we do have good evidence of African Americans helping to operate and repair the canal after the canal, shortly after the canal was completed. Notably, this is Solomon Northup, born free in Minerva, New York, in 1807 or 1808. Minerva's kind of near the Vermont border. Solomon Northup wrote in his memoirs, which I'll get to what they are in a second, discussing how in the winter of 1834, he worked in Fort Edwards on the Champlain Canal, repairing the canal, and then actually was able to make enough money that he was able to purchase his own canal boat, which he largely used to haul timber from Lake Champlain, though later parts of his biography would show that he probably also traveled on the Erie at least a few times, or was fairly well acquainted. Now, Solomon eventually got off of the Erie Canal, or the canals in general. He sells his canal boat and takes up a number of different jobs, including playing fiddle. He is contracted to play fiddle in a circus in Washington, D.C. It turns out that circus did not exist. Instead, he was kidnapped in 1841 and sold into slavery in Louisiana, where he would spend the next 12 years of his life enslaved. He was eventually able to secure his freedom. His knowledge of New York State geography was actually pretty helpful in helping him prove that he was from New York. Not a lot of folks in Louisiana can name you places like Canajoharie and Schoharie, right? So that's helps him regain his freedom. He moves back up to New York, goes to Auburn, where he publishes his memoirs in 1853. Those are 12 Years a Slave, later turned into a Academy Award-winning film, which you may also be familiar with. And he would travel all throughout the Northeast after that, and Canada, as a prominent abolitionist speaker. And incredibly, so for a while, we had just had to take Northup's word for it. But I mentioned earlier the great work of Craig Williams with the Canal Society of New York. He came across in the New York State Archives this pay voucher made out to Mintus Northup, that is Solomon's father, that almost perfectly corroborates exactly what Solomon Northup said in his 1853 book, 12 Years a Slave. So that's an incredible artifact that we were able to find in those contracting records. You just need to know how to look as well. So there's a person in Solomon Northup who was able to find some economic security and freedom on the canal. However, we also see in his story that as long as slavery existed anywhere in New York State, he was not ever truly safe or fully free in this country. But now I want to look at another story from this time period, from the digging of the Erie Canal. It's very local to you folks. It starts out, at least, locally in Canajoharie. And that is the life of Thomas James. Thomas James was born in Canajoharie. He was born enslaved in either 1803 or 1804. As they began staking out the Erie Canal through the Mohawk Valley, Thomas James saw his opportunity to take his freedom. He saw this newly surveyed line of the canal and followed it all the way to Lockport, from where he crossed the Niagara River into Canada. where he actually helped dig the Welland Canal as well, though only briefly. Canal digging is not an enjoyable task, and Thomas James certainly did not find it so. Instead, he actually moved back. This is Thomas James, by the way. He would actually move back to New York, settling in the canal boomtown of Rochester, where first he found a job in a canal-side warehouse, sweeping the floors, doing odd jobs. But in that warehouse, over the slower winters, when the canal was frozen over, James learned how to read and write, eventually self-educated himself well enough that he would be in charge of the entire freight shipping operations for this company on the canal, and first started teaching Sunday school at Rochester's AME Zion Church before becoming ordained as a minister, where he became one of the most prominent abolitionist ministers in New York State in the 1840s. He would found Syracuse's AME Zion Church, as well as Ithaca's and Sag Harbors, before moving on to Massachusetts, and a whole life out there that it was also fascinating, but we can't get into really at the moment. It's a bit beyond our scope. Though it is important that he does become a minister in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he meets a young man recently escaped from slavery, who he starts encouraging to speak publicly, who is going to become important in this story shortly. If you haven't guessed already, that man is Frederick Douglass. Thomas James kind of starts Frederick Douglass's career as well. And there we see in Thomas James's story a man who is able to find both economic opportunity from the canal and utilize the canal as a means of escape towards Canada, which we'll see more of later. All right. So after the canal opens in 1825, it's a transformative one in a number of ways. One of the ways it transforms upstate New York State, the nation in general, is you've now got thousands of people traveling all over this canal, bouncing off one another, bouncing new ideas, and they're carrying new ideas with them. One of the first major new kind of intellectual movements along the canal is what's known as the Second Great Awakening. This new evangelical Christianity. Western New York becomes known as the burned over district. The area is burned over with the fires of religious passion, that sort of thing. These new preachers are preaching kind of a form of more moral perfectionism, saying that you have the ability and the duty to make both yourself and society as morally perfect as you can. And a number of reform movements spring out of this, most notably the temperance movement, women's rights movement, and the abolition movement. We're obviously going to look at closely today, but just know those three movements are oftentimes very closely linked during this time period. These reformers start putting their ideas into practice. One interesting early example of this is the Oneida Institute, founded in Whitesboro. Originally, there's kind of an agricultural industrial school, but in 1827, one of these Second Great Awakening preachers, a man by the name of Beriah Green, becomes president of the Oneida Institute and does something radical, which he integrates the school. It will become the first school of higher education that has both black and white students learning at the same time in it. And on this map, you can see it. It's labeled the Whitestown Seminary. This line right here is the Erie Canal, so it's right off of the canal. And this school will become an important incubator for kind of the second major generation of abolitionists along the canal. and will actually train a number of famous ministers and orators. One of its most famous alumni is this man. This is Jermaine Wesley Logan. He was a freedom seeker from Tennessee originally. He got educated at the Oneida Institute, became ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and took over for Thomas James in Syracuse's AME Zion Church, becoming its most prominent leader. He's this firebrand minister and orator. He travels all over the canal. He writes a lot and also is actively working on the Underground Railroad. It's estimated that between 1,000 to 2,000 people would pass through his home on East Genesee Street in Syracuse on their way towards Canada. Also, a number of the other way people get this new reform message out is through newspapers and publishing. We already saw Solomon Northup's best-selling book, 12 Years a Slave. You also have a guy we've already mentioned, seen here, the most famous newspaper kind of along the Canal Corridor that's pro-abolition is Frederick Douglass's North Star papers, later the Frederick Douglass papers, but also a person who combines several of the things we've been talking about here is this man. This is Samuel Ringgold Ward. He is educated at the Oneida Institute, becomes a pretty famous abolitionist orator. He also publishes a number of newspapers in Syracuse, including the Freeman and the Impartial Citizen, both pro-abolition newspapers. He would also write his own autobiography as well, which was pretty well selling as well. So all these folks are creating this milieu along the canal of resistance to slavery, and they are calling for its abolition nationally. But they are not alone. Obviously, just a few kind of voices in the wilderness aren't enough to make a movement. Over the years, however, as this reform movement grows, people start getting together and creating actual organized groups calling for the abolition of slavery. First, you have local towns, then counties are creating anti-slavery societies. And in 1835, even New York State will try to found its own anti-slavery society. One of the major backers of that is this man. This is Gerrit Smith. Lived in Peterborough. He would today be a billionaire, but he got swept up in a lot of these reform movements and spent a considerable amount of his fortune on that and helped to try to bankroll this new New York State anti-slavery society. But there are a lot of other people also involved in this. So in 1835, they attempt to meet in the booming canal town of Utica. However, this is where we have to discuss another kind of myth or misconception people might have. When you think about abolition, a lot of times the idea is that like everyone in New York State suddenly, once slavery was abolished here in New York, this switch was flipped and everyone was against slavery. That is very much not the case. And we can see that very clearly in 1835. When this anti-slavery society tries to organize in Utica, they are attacked by an angry mob that drives them out of the church where they are meeting. And that mob is led by Utica's sitting congressman at the time and New York State Supreme Court Justice. So very powerful people. And the Erie Canal provides, in a lot of ways, good reason to support the institution of slavery, at least economically, a good reason. We recently went through at the museum tolls collected on just raw cotton, and something like on average, about $9 million of cotton a year traveled down the Erie Canal. So it is not an insignificant amount of money that is being made off of enslaved labor by New Yorkers as well. So that is an important thing to take note of. But anyway, this mob attacks the 1835 convening of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society, driving this group out of this church. There's about 300 delegates, and when they're driven out, Gerrit Smith offers his estate in Peterborough as a new site to host the society. About 100 of those delegates will board an empty canal lumber boat on the way to Canastota, New York, and then they would march up the hill to Peterborough, Gerrit Smith's home. Many of the other delegates also traveled to Peterborough, but over land. This is a canal talk. They would convene here in what is now the Smithfield Community Center and the National Abolition Hall of Fame. So if you ever wonder why the Abolition Hall of Fame is kind of in the middle of Madison County, that's why. These anti-slavery groups are also where women can begin to, for one of the first times in American history, begin flexing their political might and will. And we see a number of women's anti-slavery societies forming all along the canal. I'm just highlighting one notable example here, 1837. The Lockport Female Anti-Slavery Society is built in the great canal town of Lockport. And in fact, the wife of Erie Canal engineer David Thomas was the secretary of this organization. So yet another kind of canal connection. Eventually, these societies, they start realizing they have to try to make political change. In 1840, you have the founding of the Liberty Party, New York's Liberty Party, the first political party with an explicit political platform being the abolition of slavery, is founded in Geneseo. And one of the kind of keynote speakers at that first gathering is this man, who has a canal town named after him and was integral in the construction of the Erie Canal, Myron Holley, one of the canal commissioners when they began building the Erie Canal. Myron Holley eventually became a newspaper publisher who, among other things, was an ardent abolitionist. Now the town of Holly on the Erie Canal is named after him. But he was the treasurer for most of the construction of the Erie Canal as well. So another interesting canal connection to the abolition movement. So those are kind of the more legal methods by which people attempt to enact change in the abolition movement. But it's not the only way. People are trying to resist the institution of slavery. You also have the formation during this time period of vigilance committees. These are, you can almost imagine them as your local chapter of the Underground Railroad, if you will. These are people who are looking out for freedom seekers on their escape from slavery and helping them in whatever ways they can: food, shelter, information, money, etc. One of the most notable of these is the Albany Vigilance Committee, which is in part led by this man, Stephen Myers, and his wife, Harriet. Their house is now the Underground Railroad Education Center, but they assist freedom seekers on their voyages either to Canada or to different towns throughout the North. In the late 1830s, New York, as well as a number of other states, enact what are called personal freedom laws, which make it a bit easier it makes it harder for Southern enslavers to try to reclaim people as being enslaved by them and send them back to the South. So in a lot of cases, people are kind of able to blend into especially larger cities like Syracuse, Buffalo, Rochester, etc. But anyway, this also leads us to the Underground Railroad. Now, there are Underground Railroad stations throughout the state. I would warn you, I've heard this from a lot of kind of Underground Railroad scholars. There's a lot of people who, if you have an old house and it has like a weird closet in it, there's always this kind of like passed down rumor that a house was on the Underground Railroad and whatnot. There's a lot of debate over whether that's true or not, and how much stock you can put into that sort of thing. But nonetheless, there are lots of documented Underground Railroad stations throughout New York. This map is pretty interesting. This is from the Great Depression era, where among many New Deal programs, oral historians were sent out to talk to people who did remember the Underground Railroad, and they traced out kind of some of the more important routes. And you'll notice in New York, one of the major routes almost exactly parallels the Erie Canal, as well as the Oswego Canal towards Canada. Makes sense. Nothing on the Champlain, but I'm sure that was also kind of a route. But while it parallels the Erie Canal, if you know your New York State transportation, pretty much every major transportation route through New York takes that same route. It's very important. A lot of you are in the Mohawk River Valley, so you completely understand why that little valley is where all of New York's transportation is kind of funneled through. And that's all to say, the Erie Canal is not necessarily an optimal route for freedom seekers. It's owned and operated by New York State. So, like we just discussed, not all New Yorkers, in fact, probably a majority of New Yorkers, are not in favor of abolition. So New York State itself, the government, is not super into helping freedom seekers. The Erie Canal passed, all these towns grow out from the Erie Canal. So it is a very visible place right in the middle of town. So if you're trying to do something, it's pretty illegal, not great to do it. Also, the Erie Canal is a fairly expensive mode of transportation. Comparatively, I mean, if you are escaping slavery, you're leaving everything behind you. You have practically no money, let alone to buy a canal boat ticket. Instead, you're probably going to take either walk, get a wagon, or increasingly, people could kind of hop on a railroad, which also moved a lot faster than a canal boat. The other big reason why we don't have tons of evidence of Underground Railroad activity directly on the Erie Canal is, again, people are breaking the law. And generally, when you commit crimes, you don't, write it down. That's if you're planning on committing any crimes, I highly recommend not leaving a paper trail, right? And the same thing was true back then. So even if people were using the Erie Canal, finding the historic evidence of that can be challenging. Though we will talk about a few instances we have where we can see some evidence of the Erie Canal being utilized for Underground Railroad activity. All right, which leads us to our first kind of major Underground Railroad event of this talk. The Harriet Powell Rescue. This happened in Syracuse in October of 1839. John Davenport, a Mississippi plantation owner, and his family arrived in Syracuse. They were meeting primarily Mrs. Davenport's family, which was from just south of Syracuse in Onondaga Hill, and they were accompanied by Harriet Powell, who was enslaved by them. They stay here, that's pictured, the Syracuse House, right off the Erie Canal in Clinton Square. It's kind of Syracuse's finest hotel. Like I said, the Erie Canal transforms New York. And one of the many ways it changes New York is now to service all of these passengers, tons of hotels spring up. Though, much like today, hotel work is not a particularly glamorous job. So oftentimes, marginalized communities end up working in these hotels. So you have a lot of Black employees, many of them actually freedom seekers themselves, working in these hotels. So they're not great jobs, but if you're trying to form a network across the state to help people make their way to freedom, it is actually pretty helpful to be in these positions. You have a lot of freedom to communicate, and you also get to hear, get all sorts of information from people traveling, etc. And just such a person is working in the Syracuse House in 1839. This is Thomas Leonard, himself a freedom seeker from Maryland. He actually worked for a time as a canal boatman, and he would approach Harriet, asking her if she wanted to escape to Canada. Eventually, she agreed. On October 8th, 1839, at a farewell party to the Davenports, Harriet got into an awaiting carriage that took her south to Marcellus and a house on the Underground Railroad. What does this have to do with the Erie Canal other than it's taking place on its banks? Well, it took about 15 minutes for the Davenports to realize Harriet was gone, and the first thing that the authorities did at all was stop the packet boat headed north to Oswego to search it, which makes us think that, people at least suspected the canal was being used as a transportation route on the Underground Railroad. But also, like I said, she was heading the opposite direction, headed to Marcellus. She spends about the next month traveling about southern Onondaga and Madison counties before arriving on October 28th at the estate of Garrett Smith in Peterborough. She would stay about a day there, and she would even meet Garrett Smith's young cousin, woman by the name of Elizabeth Cady, who about a year would become Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the famous women's rights advocate, who in her own writings said that this meeting with Harriet Powell was a transformative moment in her life, compelling her to fight for greater human rights. Yes, also from Johnstown, New York, another local connection to you all. And after that, Harriet would move north via wagon, crossing the St. Lawrence River into Kingston, Ontario, where she would live out the rest of her life. She would get married, have 6 kids, and passed away 20 years later in 1859. So there's kind of a major moment where all this organizing that we've been talking about, this advocacy, starts to really pay off. This is a national news story. Things really begin to change with abolition in New York and just nationally as well, with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. There had already been a Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1793, but it wasn't nearly as effective as the South wanted it to be. I mentioned those personal freedom laws. Those are kind of loopholes to get around that. However, after the Mexican-American War, America gains significant amounts of territory. There's a big fight over what's going to happen with that, especially in regards to slavery. And ultimately, what's known as the Compromise of 1850 is reached. One part of that is the creation of an act. This new law would punish people who were assisting freedom seekers at all, and officials who did not actively pursue, even in free states, freedom seekers could face serious penalties of both fines and jail time. So before, a sympathetic state official could look the other way, but now they are legally mandated to do whatever in their power they could to try to recapture a person trying to escape enslavement. And also, people who were arrested under this act, under being accused of being freedom seekers, had practically no legal rights at all, and relatively little evidence was needed to convict you and send you to slavery. Um, an additional kind of nuance of this law was that judges who found someone not guilty of having escaped slavery, so saying you're a free person, you got $5 for trying that case. But if you found that a person needed to be sent to slavery, you got $10. So there's another economic incentive to support the institution of slavery. And this law would be enacted September 18th, 1850, by President Millard Fillmore. Again, this is a New Yorker. I want to kind of point that out. Yes, from Buffalo, New York. So, yeah, again, we see northern politicians, northern states, who slavery might not be legal in their states, but they are still helping to propagate this systemic racist institution. Which leads us to the story of the Harrises. William and Catherine Harris were originally enslaved in South Carolina, but had taken their freedom and settled in Philadelphia for a while. However, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, they, like thousands of other formerly enslaved people who were living throughout the North, aren't going to take their chances and begin kind of this major exodus north towards Canada, which had abolished slavery in the 1830s. They take the kind of classic route through New York, go to New York City, up the Hudson River, and then up to Albany, where they meet with what newspaper articles called their quote-unquote friends, most likely members of the Albany Vigilance Committee, who we already talked about, and they book them passage on the canal boat of Hartwell C. Webster, which is headed towards Rochester. From there, they were supposed to take a steamboat across the lake to Canada and freedom. They also bring with them their recent child. However, on the canal boat, the crew and passengers learn that the Harrises are freedom seekers and begin harassing them about that, specifically telling them that their former enslaver knows where they are and is coming for them. This terrifies the Harrises, and when they reach Syracuse, so after the long level, 64 straight miles down a lock, at the Lodi locks, they're convinced that the harassment of the crew is true, and when they reach these locks, there's all sorts of shuffling and whatnot that goes on at locks, and rather than return to slavery, they would attempt to take their own lives. Fortunately, both William and Catherine survived. Sadly, their child drowned in the canal. This is an image in our collection memorializing the child and Catherine who jumped into the canal. Incidents like this are horrible. We recognize it today, and people back in the 1850s also could understand that these incidents are absolutely egregious and horrible. Following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, Northern opinion is kind of electrified, and incidents like the Harris family tragedy really arouse public anger against the Fugitive Slave Act, and a lot of new vigilance committees form up. Syracuse's forms right after kind of this incident. That leads us to the Gerry Rescue. William Gerry Henry was himself a freedom seeker who came to Syracuse in the winter of 1849-50 from Missouri. He started working as a cabinet maker, then a cooper on Salina Street in Syracuse. On May 26, 1851, so Syracuse has become this major center of abolition after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. Jermaine Wesley Logan is really that operation I kind of mentioned his, helping possibly thousands of people reach freedom in Canada. It's really starting to ramp up, and Syracuse is gaining a reputation. So much so, on May 26, 1851, Secretary of State Daniel Webster rolls into Syracuse on a train. And from a balcony, which you can still see today, right next to City Hall, delivers this speech to people opposing the Fugitive Slave Act. Quote, "It is treason, treason, and nothing else. Depend upon it. The law will be executed in its spirit and to the letter. It will be executed in all the great cities. Here in Syracuse, in the midst of the next anti-slavery convention, if the occasion should arise. Then we shall see what becomes of their lives and their sacred honors." So in that quote, he's pretty much threatening the people of Syracuse if they want to disobey the Fugitive Slave Act. It's accusing the people of Syracuse of treason for disobeying this law. And says, we're going to enforce this law, perhaps at the next anti-slavery convention in the city. Fast forward to October 1st, 1851, when New York State's Liberty Party was holding their convention right around the corner from where Webster gave that speech. It's the Liberty Party's meeting, and at noon on October 1st, Jerry was arrested and brought to the law offices of Judge Joseph Sabine, where he's kind of held for sort of pre-trial stuff, basic things that happen when you get arrested. Haven't had that happen, but what I imagine basic arrest stuff goes on when these abolitionists from the Liberty Party march up to Clinton Square, go into the offices of Judge Sabine, and start smashing, desks and benches and stuff, causing enough of a ruckus that Jerry is able to escape from the courtroom. However, he is still in chains from his arrest, and many reports say it's actually as he is crossing a canal bridge, he is reapprehended. So again, we see the canal being kind of visible in hindering escape attempts. But he's brought back to Clinton Square and sent to the city jail, which would be right across the street from where this monument we're looking at is now. As night fell, a crowd of 2,000 to 3,000 people, though, gathered in the square. So that organizing that we talked about is paying off. Abolitionists from around central New York flock to Syracuse, and they start demanding Jerry's release. Eventually, when the federal agents who are holding Jerry don't just meet those demands, the crowd begins to actively try to take Jerry's release. They will assault the prison with paving stones and timbers, and this much larger crowd, one of the federal agents jumps out of the second-story window into the canal, breaking his arm. The other pushes Jerry out to the crowd, and now Jerry's able to kind of blend into this much larger crowd now, and is taken to a Underground Railroad station in Syracuse, where his shackles are removed, and eventually he will make his way north to Oswego and then across Lake Ontario to Kingston, where he would live out the remainder of his life. This is a huge moment nationally in resistance towards slavery. One, shows the people will resort to any means necessary to resist this law in the Canal Corridor. Also, several people are arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act. It's shown that it's going to be really hard to enforce in places that are sympathetic towards abolition. Only one of the people arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act are charged or end up going to jail for anything. That is a black canal boatman by the name of Enoch Reed, who would get a lesser charge, something like interfering with an officer of law and doing his duties, that sort of thing. So shows that this law is also kind of a paper tiger. Syracuse for the next decade would celebrate Jerry Rescue Day, and some of the most notable abolitionist thinkers and speakers would come to this event. They had to use the train station. It was the only venue large enough to hold the massive crowds that would come for this. So yeah, that's the Jerry Rescue. However, acts like the Jerry Rescue Day celebration would actually end following John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. This became increasingly obvious that acts of resistance like the Jerry Rescue weren't going to be enough to get slavery abolished. And eventually, the slavery question will boil over into the American Civil War, in which the Erie Canal and other New York State canals play an important role, primarily in transporting supplies. However, a number of canal boatmen also will enlist in the Army and Navy as well. However, at first, African Americans along the canal are not allowed to enlist in combat units. It's not until the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, that black regiments begin to be formed. Perhaps the most famous of these is the one pictured right here. This is the 54th Massachusetts. Jermaine Wesley Logan and Frederick Douglass go on speaking tours of the Canal Corridor, recruiting from the black communities within them. March 11th and 26th, they will speak in Syracuse, recruiting for the 54th Massachusetts. And you might say, well, why are they recruiting for this Massachusetts regiment in New York? That's because since this is going to be kind of the first black fighting unit, there's a lot of symbolism in that. So they want people from all over kind of America to join this unit. And indeed, New Yorkers will answer this call. And using the rolls of the 54th Massachusetts, we were able to find 17 members of this regiment who were from canal communities who listed themselves either as boatmen or sailors, to indicate they were probably working on the Erie Canal, which I think is interesting in general, just to think about the sheer diversity on the canal. I mean, there's 17 black canal boatmen who go all the way to Boston to enlist in this regiment. So presumably there are even more throughout the canal corridor as well, perhaps joining other regiments as well. So an interesting area for future research. We could possibly find more black canal boatmen this way. But anyway, by the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African Americans will serve in the Union Armed Forces, representing about 10% of the nation's total strength in the war. New York State as well will have the most recruits in general for the Union forces and suffer the heaviest casualties of any Union state. So do a lot in that final fight for abolition, right? Of course, after the Civil War, the Union wins. The 13th Amendment is passed, which abolishes slavery in most cases, abolishes the prison system. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but even though slavery is over, the systems of oppression and racism that supported it obviously don't go away. Neither do African Americans along the canal. Black people will play an incredibly important role on and along the canal for years to come afterwards. And still, that struggle for equal rights continues. I find this a very moving image. Erie Canal Museum's right here. That balcony Daniel Webster spoke from right here. This is Syracuse City Hall. And this is a picture from June 6, 2020. Syracuse's biggest Black Lives Matter rally. About 3,000 people gathered here outside of City Hall to continue this fight for equal rights and for justice, right along the historic banks of the Erie Canal. That's my presentation. Stop my share. There we go. All right. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Derrick. I will make it a point to not only thank you, but also be extremely grateful for that informative, poignant, and very relevant presentation. For those of you tuning in, please feel free to drop comments and questions in the chat. Then we can ask Derrick. I wanted to at least also make the comment that I'm glad that you touched on that there's a particularly pre-Civil War, but even afterwards, there's this difference between an anti-slavery sentiment or notion or move toward abolitionism, and that also being different than being anti-racist or being leaning in that way. I mean, the whole concept between the settlement of Liberia and with under Monroe
Right.
harkens to that. It's essentially so racist that they don't want blacks to even be in the country. It has less
Yes.
to do with them being slaves. There is a comment here from Kelly. A number of black men from Montgomery County served in the 54th Massachusetts as well as the rest of the 20th USCT, or the colored troops.
Yeah.
So that's a valuable point, and I will only conjecture that, as Kelly had mentioned, that she's from Montgomery County, that I know who Kelly is, and I appreciate her tuning in to this program. And if she has any other comments about James from Canajoharie, that she can feel free to put those in the comments too, and I'll pass that along. Got a great presentation coming in from Liz, making that comment. If anybody has questions, definitely put them in there. Trying to
Yeah.
take this.
Thomas James, I find fascinating. He should be talked about a lot more. And his memoirs are available online. So
Nice. Is that
great.
an easy Google read type search?
Yes.
Somebody
Yeah,
just
if you look for Thomas James memoir, it's pretty easy to find on Google.
right. Let's see, I made a few other. I'm glad you touched on Millard Fillmore being a guy from Buffalo, and that the difficulty in tracing any of this, particularly during years where the Fugitive Slave Act was really in full tilt. Um, it might have been a little bit difficult to enforce, but it obviously was um, being a law kind of makes it harder for people to be as open or as honest or to document it and make valid.
Interestingly, Jermaine Wesley Logan, he was kind of famous-ish, or at least we have evidence of him. He would kind of taunt federal authorities once freedom seekers had reached Canada and like put out newspaper releases saying that so and so had read, but usually those don't say like they took the Erie Canal. That's
Right.
a great way to
You might gloat that people are
have
now
more
free,
success.
but you're not telling them how they got there.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm glad you bring up the Myers family and the Underground Railroad Education Center in Albany. It's a worthwhile adventure to learn more about it, to take a trip into Albany and visit uh, the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence. It's eye-opening on so many levels. You started the program talking about education in New York and being a New Yorker, and other folks that come in, and they definitely feel it's a very Southern thing. So we do our best to make sure that people do realize that slavery existed in New York well beyond um, what a lot of people might think of it as well. And I'll share this just because we're on topic and it seems relevant, and oddly enough, an occurrence that actually happened today. And I'll make it a point because I was not really necessarily surprised, but I'm still taken back. I had a visitor at the site today that did actually make a comment, to paraphrase, that not all enslavers were bad people, or that some of the slaves were treated pretty well. And I thought that was beyond dismissive. And as a white woman, she should know at least there is an oppression that still exists for her, and that making those kind of comments, it's not being woke. It's just being real,
Yes.
that is a very naive thing to state.
Right.
So
Yes. No. Slavery is bad. Overall, yep, it's morally wrong. I see an interesting comment in the chat that we've got more info on Thomas James and where they may have identified where he was enslaved. I'd be quite interested in Canalway.
and that helps me confirm that Kelly is the Kelly, I believe, the county historian, and it'd be worthwhile to get you two connected if there's more information on that. Heavily involved in the consortium in New York State for the Underground Railroad, so
That'd be
we'll
great.
connect you two. So.
Cool.
And Hal's asking if there's a plaque about James and Canalway. Not that I'm aware of, and if Kelly wants to answer that question, I know there's a few other plaques, and there is actually in Montgomery County several locations. The county Department of History and Archives, because of Kelly in particular, has a wonderful map of locations throughout the county, and particularly there's walking tour information in Canalway specifically. That if anybody's curious, I'm sure reaching out to them or reaching out to us, we can pass that information along. And she says that she's not aware of any plaque, but when those
Great William Pomeroy Foundation.
yes, there's an opportunity there, absolutely. So if there's any other questions or comments, please pop them in now as I begin to wrap this up. Seeing none, though, there's
Well, I'll just get in a quick plug since I'm talking to a virtual audience here. Most Erie Canal Museum talks are available virtually as well. We also record them, so check us out. Go to eriecanalmuseum.org and register. Next week we've got talks on the Ohio and Erie and Delaware and Lehigh canals, plus on a humorous history of caskets. So
I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, it's a great talk.
So I put the link up for those of you that are tuning in now, and for those that may be listening, watching, or otherwise engaging with us at a later date on YouTube or elsewhere. I will make sure that there are links on there as well. Be sure to check out eriecanalmuseum.org. And thank you all very much for tuning in, for checking this out. And I am super grateful to Derrick Pratt from the Erie Canal Museum, and all the research that goes into these programs for offering this presentation virtually as we celebrate our 8th annual New York State History Month lecture series from Schoharie Crossing. Thank you again, Derrick.
Yep. Thank you.
Take care and be well.
Yes, you too. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.